Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The sun had dipped halfway across the Enugu sky when Adana's phone rang, its shrill tones slicing through the hum of traffic and the chatter of neighbors that floated into her apartment window. She was standing in her small kitchen, her hands deep in a bowl of yam flour as she prepared the evening's meal. Her face brightened at the sight of her husband's name flashing on the screen, but as soon as she answered, the casual cheer in his voice brought with it a weight she could not explain. He laughed about how his old schoolmate Chike had offered to buy him lunch, saying she should not worry, that he was safe and enjoying a well-deserved break. His words carried the kind of warmth that had always reassured her, but beneath the laughter, Adana felt a tug in her chest, a disquiet she could neither name nor silence. She asked him softly what meal it was, and when he mentioned rice, something in her spirit recoiled. Rice was ordinary, yet in that moment, it sounded like a whisper of trouble. She remembered how Chike often visited them, how his eyes followed Emeka when news of another contract came, how his laughter sometimes cracked like glass trying to hold too much water. She wanted to brush the thought aside, but her instincts clung stubbornly, urging her to be careful. So she reminded her husband in a measured tone, warning him that envy can sometimes wear the face of a brother, and though he chuckled, assuring her that Chike was family in every sense, her unease grew like a shadow stretching over a fading day. Adana leaned against the counter after the call ended, her eyes fixed on the yam flour, though her mind was far from the kitchen. The city outside buzzed with its usual rhythm, the honking of Kiki Napep drivers weaving through traffic, children laughing as they chased each other across the compound, and the aroma of roasted plantain wafting through the air from a roadside vendor. Yet for Adana, the sounds of Enugu carried a dull echo that afternoon, as though the city's pulse had slowed to match her own unease. She thought of her husband at work, seated in a bustling office or perhaps under the shade of a tree, laughing with Chike while waiting for their meal. The image should have comforted her, but instead, it unsettled her deeply. She recalled past conversations between Emeka and Chike, moments when Chike's smile had faltered, his words veiled with something heavier than mere frustration. Envy has a way of sneaking into friendships, she thought, like weeds creeping between cracks in cement, often unnoticed until the ground begins to split. She did not want to dwell on it, yet her heart refused peace. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on a cloth and whispered a prayer under her breath, asking for God's covering over her husband. Still, a gnawing voice inside whispered that prayer alone might not shield him from the dangers hidden in plain sight. She recalled her last words on the call, asking him to switch plates if possible, and though she said it half in jest, her spirit had meant every word. The thought of food, a simple daily gift, turning into a weapon unsettled her in a way that no words could carry. As the evening stretched on, Adana found herself staring often at the clock, counting the hours until Emeka would return home. She busied herself with chores to silence her mind, scrubbing the veranda until her arms ached, and arranging the clothes in their wardrobe, though they hardly needed rearranging. Each knock at the gate jolted her, though it was only children returning from errands or neighbors exchanging greetings. The city outside remained alive, buses rattling down pothole-ridden roads, market women calling out their wares, the faint music of a high-life band drifting from a bar down the street, but inside her heart was a storm brewing. She sat by the window and watched the moon struggle through the haze of evening clouds, wondering if her husband had truly listened to her warning. Emeka had always been the type to dismiss fear with laughter, a man too trusting for his own good. She loved that about him, yet tonight it frightened her. What if he brushed off her words again? What if the loyalty he felt for Chike blinded him to the shadows she sensed? Her thoughts turned restless, weaving images of her husband's laughter turning into silence, his joy cut short by betrayal hidden in a plate of rice. She pressed her palms together and closed her eyes, whispering another prayer, but the unease clung to her still, as stubborn as a stain on white cloth. By the time Emeka's footsteps echoed in the compound later that night, Adana was nearly breathless with relief. She opened the door to see him smiling, weary from the day but whole, his arms swinging easily as if nothing unusual had happened. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and placed his bag on the chair, his words bubbling with cheer as he recounted the day's events. Adana listened carefully, searching his tone for signs of strain, her eyes darting to his face for hints of discomfort. But there was nothing, No cough, no wince, no heaviness. He was as healthy and lively as he had always been. She wanted to ask about the rice, to know whether he had switched plates or eaten the one his friend had offered, but the question dissolved on her lips. He laughed about work, teased her about the meal she had prepared, and spoke with such lightness that for a moment she felt foolish for worrying. Yet when she lay beside him later that night, her eyes open in the dark while his soft snores filled the room, the unease returned. It hovered in the silence like a restless spirit, reminding her that even in laughter, danger sometimes hides. She clutched the edge of her wrapper tightly, her heart heavy with the knowledge that peace, however sweet, can sometimes be the calm before a storm. That night, Enugu glowed under scattered bulbs and neon lights, its restless spirit humming like a market that never truly closed. The city was alive, the honks of late-night taxis, the sputtering engines of Okadas darting through narrow streets, the laughter of young men lingering around beer parlors as if morning would never come. But inside Adana's home, quiet pressed against the walls, leaving only the ticking clock and the sound of her husband's even breathing. She lay wide awake, her eyes tracing patterns in the dark, her heart carrying a weight that sleep could not lighten. Emeka had laughed earlier about her concerns, calling them the overprotective musings of a wife who worried too much, but Adana knew what she felt in her bones. She remembered the look on Chaik's face during their last visit, how he had smiled, yet his eyes lingered on Emeka's new wristwatch longer than they lingered on conversation. She thought of the way he often sighed when contracts slipped into Emeka's hands, sighs dressed as jokes but heavy with unspoken meaning. She did not want to hate him, for Emeka had insisted that Chaik was like a brother, a companion through school days and beyond, a man whose laughter had carried him through hardships. Still, no matter how she arranged her thoughts, envy was a poison that could seep into the strongest bonds, and tonight her heart whispered warnings that she could not silence. She turned on her side, watching the faint light of the street lamps slip through the curtains, and wondered if tomorrow would confirm her fears or prove her foolish. Adana rose before dawn, her body weary but her spirit restless. She moved about the house with a heaviness she tried to hide, setting water on the stove, arranging Emeka's clothes, and watching as he prepared for the day's work. He hummed softly while dressing, the kind of tune that floated without care, yet to Adana, it sounded like a man whistling on the edge of a cliff. He greeted her with his usual smile, kissed her forehead, and assured her of another productive day, but in her silence he sensed her worry. "Adana," he said gently, "don't carry yesterday into today. I know your heart means well, but Chaik is my friend. He will never harm me." She forced a smile, swallowing her doubts, but his words clung to her mind like stubborn thorns. After he left, she stood by the window and watched his figure disappear into the streets of Enugu, blending with workers hurrying to offices, market women dragging baskets to their stalls, and school children in neatly pressed uniforms chasing after buses. The city bustled, unaware of the storm building quietly in her chest. She wished she could shake off the thought, convince herself she was mistaken, but her instincts screamed otherwise. She whispered a prayer once more, her lips trembling, asking that the man she loved would not find betrayal hidden in the place he trusted most. Meanwhile, Emeka moved through his day with the ease of a man accustomed to success but untouched by suspicion. At the site where his current contract was being handled, laborers greeted him with respect, their voices rising above the clang of iron and the grind of machines. Chaik arrived shortly after, carrying the kind of cheer that could disarm suspicion. He clapped Emeka on the back, his laughter rising above the noise, and spoke with the easy familiarity of brothers bound by history. To the men around them, they seemed inseparable, two men who had built dreams side by side, who had walked from school corridors into the uncertain fields of adulthood with loyalty as their shield. Yet beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. When Emeka shared news of another opportunity in Lagos that he might secure, Chaik's smile faltered for only a moment, but Adana would have seen it for what it was, the sting of envy tucked behind a mask of joy. Emeka, blind to it, continued his story with excitement, unaware that sometimes shadows follow closest to the ones who walk in light. Chaik nodded, laughed, and pretended, but his silence afterward held weight. It was the kind of silence that did not echo in words but in the tightening of a jaw, the narrowing of eyes, the quick glance that lingered too long. If Emeka noticed, he paid it no mind, for to him, friendship was a garment he wore proudly, one he would never imagine unraveling. As evening crept back into the city, painting the streets in gold and shadow, Adana sat by the window again, waiting for the sound of her husband's return. She had spent the day trying to bury her thoughts in chores and conversation with neighbors, yet unease remained her constant companion. Children played in the compound, their laughter ringing out like bells, but for her, each sound was distant, muffled by the storm inside. She thought of Emika's laughter, so carefree, and wondered how a man so trusting could survive in a world where envy sat at every corner like a beggar waiting for alms. She thought of Chike's presence in their lives, how often he had sat at their table, eaten from their pot, shared in their joys and sorrows. How does a heart that receives kindness still nurse bitterness? She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, whispering her fears into the night. When Emika finally walked through the door, his face bright with cheer, she smiled and served him his meal, but inside her chest, her heart beat like a drum of war. She longed to ask him about his day, to pry deeper into what Chike had said or done, but her tongue felt heavy. Instead, she laughed with him, masking her worry, while her spirit remained restless. For she knew that sometimes the greatest storms announce themselves not with thunder, but with silence that grows heavier each day. The following day unfolded with the deceptive ease of routine, the type of day that seems to promise nothing unusual, yet carries under its surface the weight of unseen currents. Emika left early, his stride brisk, his mood light as he waved at neighbors and exchanged casual greetings along the way. Adana, standing at the doorway, watched him disappear into the noise of Enugu's morning bustle. She tried to shake off the unease that had lingered through the night, telling herself that perhaps she had exaggerated her fears, that maybe she had allowed suspicion to become larger than reason. The day crawled slowly as she attended to chores, scrubbing, washing, arranging, and yet finding no peace in any of them. The city around her was alive, hawkers calling out prices at the top of their lungs, impatient drivers weaving in and out of traffic, children balancing lunch packs as they hurried to school. But her thoughts strayed constantly to her husband. She pictured him at work, surrounded by colleagues, with Chike never too far from his side. She recalled how, during their call the day before, she had teased him to swap plates when the food came, and though she said it with laughter, her heart had meant it. But Emika was not a man who believed in suspicion. He was a man who saw the best in everyone, even when shadows stood right before him. She wondered whether he had heeded her suggestion, or brushed it aside as another of her endless worries. Each thought circled her mind like a restless bird, refusing to land, until the day began to feel longer than any she had known. By late afternoon, the walls of the house felt too narrow for her unsettled spirit, and she stepped outside into the compound, where the air carried the smell of roasted maize and the sharp tang of exhaust fumes from passing vehicles. She greeted a neighbor, watched the children skip rope under the mango tree, and listened as the city hummed around her, but even these familiar rhythms offered no comfort. Every sound reminded her of the fragile line between safety and disaster. A kiki sped past, its passengers laughing heartily, and she envied their lightness, wishing her own heart could share in such ease. She thought again of her husband's loyalty to Chike, how he had always defended him, always insisted that their bond was beyond betrayal. Loyalty was a beautiful garment, she thought, but when worn blindly, it could cover the eyes until danger was too close to escape. She sat on a stool outside the kitchen door and allowed her memories to wander, back to their early days when Chike visited frequently, always cheerful, always with a joke at hand, and how over time those visits had begun to carry a subtle heaviness. She had seen it in his eyes, though Emika never noticed, a certain shadow whenever another contract was won, a pause in his laughter when success was shared. These recollections did nothing to calm her, only sharpening the edges of her unease. She returned indoors eventually, sitting by the window as the shadows of evening stretched across the streets, her eyes fixed on the gate, waiting for Emika's return like a sailor's wife scanning the horizon for sails. When Emika finally arrived, the air seemed to shift with him, carrying the scent of dust and sweat and the noise of the world he had just stepped out from. He was smiling, relaxed, his voice carrying the warmth of a man satisfied with the day's labor. Adana, watching him remove his shoes and settle into his chair, felt a brief rush of relief, but beneath it was a wave of questions pressing against her lips. She wanted to ask him about lunch, about whether he had eaten the food Chike brought, about whether he had remembered her words, but she held back, fearing that her questions would sound like accusations. He spoke freely about the day, about the workers, about the minor challenges at the site, his laughter filling the room as naturally as it always did. She laughed with him, forcing her own spirit to match his lightness, but her ears were alert for any hint of discomfort, her eyes scanning him for signs of unease. Nothing. He ate the meal she prepared for him at home with his usual appetite, praising her cooking, teasing her gently, and assuring her of his well-being. Adana smiled, but deep inside her heart, the questions remained unanswered. For even when everything looks calm, a woman's instinct rarely lies, and tonight, her instincts whispered that something had shifted, even if she could not yet name it. The night wore on quietly, the kind of night that seemed ordinary to anyone passing by, but within their walls, Adana's spirit carried a tension as sharp as a drawn bow. After their meal, Emeka leaned back in his chair, telling stories from his school days with Chaik, stories filled with laughter and memories of youthful mischief. Adana listened, her lips curved in a smile, but her heart weighed every word. It struck her how much of their lives Chaik had been a part of, how deeply his presence had been woven into their family's fabric. She thought of the contracts Emeka had generously shared with him, the opportunities handed to him without hesitation, and she wondered how such kindness could be met with anything but gratitude. The city outside had grown quieter. Only the occasional bark of a dog or the distant rumble of a generator broke the stillness, and inside, the shadows of the lamps danced softly on the walls. Emeka rose eventually, preparing to retire for the night, his laughter still echoing in the room. Adana followed, her body weary, yet her spirit refusing rest. When they lay together in the dark, Emeka drifted quickly into sleep, but she remained awake, her thoughts weaving restlessly like threads in a loom. Something about his cheerfulness unsettled her further, as if the brightness of his mood was hiding a silence he had chosen not to share. She turned on her side, facing away, her eyes wide open as the minutes dragged into hours. Though the night appeared calm, she felt as though the ground beneath them had begun to shift, carrying them slowly but surely toward a truth that neither of them was yet prepared to face. The night that followed unfolded with deceptive quiet, the kind of silence that can fool a household into believing that all is well, even when unseen trouble is already weaving its way into the fabric of life. Adana slept lightly, her dreams broken by sudden awakenings, her ears straining for every sound in the compound. The wind rattled the zinc roof, dogs barked intermittently in the distance, and once in a while, the sharp cry of a baby from the next building pierced the silence. She turned often, her eyes seeking Emeka's sleeping figure beside her, comforted by the steady rhythm of his breathing, yet unsettled by the worry that still refused to let her go. Sometime after midnight, just when sleep began to weigh her eyelids, the shrill sound of the phone tore through the stillness. Emeka reached for it, his voice rough with sleep as he answered, but the moment he heard the words on the other end, his body stiffened. He sat up quickly, his face suddenly pale in the dim light. Adana's heart raced even before he spoke, as though her spirit had already anticipated what the caller would say. Chaik had collapsed. He had been rushed to the hospital. The words dropped into the room like heavy stones, scattering the fragile calm they had clung to all night. Adana felt her chest tighten as she searched Emeka's eyes, but his gaze was far away, caught between disbelief and fear. Without another word, they both rose, dressing hastily, their movements sharp and clumsy, as though every second lost could tip the balance between life and death. They stepped into the Enugu night, the streets quieter now, but not entirely asleep. A few taxis prowled the roads, their headlights cutting through the darkness, while late-night food vendors tended to their stalls, their fires glowing faintly like watchful eyes. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and roasted meat, mixed with the faint stench of refuse lingering at the corners of the road. Adana and Emeka moved quickly, their footsteps urgent, their minds too clouded with worry to notice the details of the world around them. The road to the hospital stretched endlessly, every passing minute thick with tension. Adana kept stealing glances at her husband, his jaw clenched, his silence heavy, his body trembling in ways he tried to hide. She thought of the conversation they had days before, her warning about envy and betrayal, and though she said nothing now, her thoughts thundered inside her. Could this be the very shadow she had sensed? Could fate have twisted her warning into a prophecy fulfilled too soon? By the time they reached the hospital gates, her stomach churned with unease, her heart beating as though it wanted to escape her chest. The sight of people gathered at the entrance, their faces etched with worry, only deepened her dread. Hospitals always carried the scent of both hope and despair, but tonight it leaned heavily toward despair, and Adana could feel it pressing against her skin like damp air. Inside the hospital, the corridors were a blur of rushing nurses, muffled voices, and the distant hum of machines. The sharp scent of antiseptic clung to everything, piercing the nose and stinging the eyes. Emeka and Adana were led quickly to a ward where Chaik lay, his once lively face pale and drawn, his body weakened, his breath shallow. Tubes snaked around him, and machines beeped steadily, though each sound seemed more fragile than the last. Emeka froze at the sight, his body stiffening as though his legs had turned to stone. This was not the image of the friend he knew, the man who once laughed easily, who spoke with energy, who shared dreams of building empires. This was a shell drained of color and strength, lying helpless under the indifferent light of a hospital lamp. Emeka moved closer, his lips trembling as he called his friend's name, but Chaik's eyes remained half-closed, fluttering weakly as though he were caught between two worlds. Adana stood behind, her own breath caught in her throat, watching the man her husband trusted most drift further away with each passing second. Doctors moved around briskly, their instructions sharp, their hands precise, but beneath their efficiency, she could sense the uncertainty. She clutched her wrapper tightly, whispering prayers that barely left her lips, her mind racing with memories of how often Chaik had sat at her table, how often he had shared in their lives, and how her spirit had always warned her of a hidden shadow in his smile. The minutes stretched into hours, though each one felt like a lifetime compressed into silence and beeping machines. Adana sat on a hard bench near the ward, her palms pressed together, her head bowed, yet her eyes remained fixed on the frail figure lying under the sheets. Emeka stayed by Chaik's side, his body bent forward, his hands gripping the metal rail of the bed so tightly his knuckles turned white. He whispered words only he and Chaik could hear, fragments of promises, fragments of memories, desperate appeals for strength that seemed too late to matter. The hospital around them pulsed with its own rhythm, footsteps echoing down the corridor, doors creaking open and shut, voices murmuring in languages of grief and hope. But for them, the world had shrunk to this single room, this single moment. Every breath that left Chaik's lips felt borrowed, every flicker of his eyelids like a struggle against an invisible tide pulling him away. Adana knew the weight of nights like this, nights when the boundary between life and death thins until it feels like a veil that could tear with the gentlest touch. She wanted to reach for Emeka, to tell him something that might soothe his breaking heart, but no words could carry the comfort he needed. Instead, she sat in silence, her spirit heavy with the knowledge that no matter how much one prepares, betrayal and loss always arrive like thieves in the night, sudden and merciless, leaving behind nothing but the echo of what once was. The room where Chaik lay seemed suspended in time, as though the hospital itself held its breath, waiting to see which way the scale of life would tilt. Emeka stood rooted beside the bed, his body trembling though he tried to hide it, his face lined with the weight of disbelief. He whispered his friend's name again, the syllables breaking on his tongue like glass shattering on stone. Chaik's eyelids fluttered, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that grew weaker by the second. The sound of the monitors filled the silence, steady, yet frighteningly fragile, and Adana felt her knees weaken as she leaned against the wall for support. Her mind drifted to the countless moments Chaik had shared with them, evenings filled with laughter, meals eaten without suspicion, jokes that once felt genuine. Now all of that was unraveling before her eyes, peeling away to reveal something darker beneath. A man she had always sensed carried envy now lay fighting for breath, and the irony of it clawed at her chest. Emeka, in his desperation, bent lower, his lips so close to Chaik's ear that his words were swallowed by the machines and the hum of fluorescent lights. It was then that Chaik's trembling hand lifted weakly, his fingers curling around Emeka's arm like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. His voice cracked, hoarse and broken, yet clear enough to pierce through the veil of silence that hung between them. Emeka froze at the first words, his eyes wide as though the world itself had tilted beneath his feet. Chaik's lips trembled as he confessed, his voice like sandpaper scraping against stone. He spoke of the rice, of how it had been meant for Emeka, not for himself, of how the poison had been prepared carefully, disguised within the ordinary meal of jollof rice they had shared so often in friendship. He spoke haltingly, pausing for breath, his words weighed down by both weakness and regret. "I never thought you would change it," he rasped, his eyes glistening with tears that refused to fall. "Adana was right. I envied you more than I should, every contract, every success, every smile you carried so easily." Emeka's throat tightened, his breath catching in his chest as he staggered backward, the words slicing through him with the cruelty of a blade. The man he had trusted with his dreams, the one he had lifted into opportunities, the one he had called brother, had been the very hand stretched out against him. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, his ears ringing, his mind reeling between disbelief and agony. His lips quivered as he tried to speak, but no words came, only a strangled gasp that sounded more like grief than language. Adana's body stiffened at the sound of the confession, her eyes widening as the dread she had carried all along hardened into truth. The air in the ward grew heavier, thick with betrayal, regret, and sorrow, pressing down on them as though the walls themselves were closing in. The confession did not stop there. Chaik went on, each word dragging itself from his fading lungs, his eyes fixed on Emeka as if begging for a forgiveness he knew he did not deserve. He spoke of nights when envy kept him awake, of moments when he smiled in Emeka's presence but cursed his fortune behind closed doors. He admitted how he had watched opportunities slip through his fingers while Emeka seemed blessed with more, and how bitterness grew inside him like a weed left untended, spreading until it choked every memory of loyalty they once shared. He admitted that he had considered other ways before, but the chance to offer food had seemed easiest, disguised under the innocence of friendship. His body shuddered as he coughed, his voice cracking further as he whispered, "I was blind. I forgot what we had, what you gave me. I forgot you lifted me when others turned their backs. I let jealousy eat me alive." His chest heaved, his strength failing, his confession pouring out like water from a cracked vessel. Emeka could only stare, his tears falling freely now, his mind trapped between the loyalty of years and the betrayal of this moment. Adana pressed her hand against her mouth, her body trembling with both horror and pity. She had known envy when she saw it, but hearing it spoken aloud with such rawness carved into her the cruel reality of what friendship can turn into when envy is allowed to fester unchecked. By the time the last words left Chaik's lips, his body had grown weak, his eyes struggling to stay open, his grip on Emeka's arm loosening with every second. Emeka bent lower, his tears falling on the hospital sheets as he whispered his friend's name over and over, as though repetition could hold back the inevitable. The doctors returned, checking the machines, adjusting drips, their faces drawn with the quiet knowledge of men who had seen too many lives slip away. Adana felt the world narrowing to the sound of her husband's broken sobs, the weight of betrayal pressing down like a mountain on his shoulders. Chaik's breathing faltered, his chest rising and falling with the uneven rhythm of a man fighting against the tide of death. His lips moved one final time, whispering words too faint for anyone but Emeka to hear, and then his chest stilled, his hand fell limp, and the room was swallowed by silence. The machines gave one long, piercing note before the doctor reached over to switch them off. Emeka collapsed into the chair beside the bed, his body shaking, his eyes hollow, his heart split open by grief and truth he could never have imagined. Adana stood behind him, her hands trembling, her face wet with tears, her soul heavy with the knowledge that they had just witnessed the collapse of trust, loyalty, and life all in one breath. The night outside the hospital moved on, indifferent to the tragedy within, but for Emeka and Adana, nothing in the world would ever be the same again. The hospital corridors emptied little by little as the night dragged toward dawn, but for Emeka and Adana, time had ceased to matter. They sat in silence, their hearts bound in grief and confusion, their eyes fixed on the lifeless figure that had once been the friend they trusted. Emeka's shoulders shook as he buried his face in his palms, his body folding in on itself under the crushing weight of betrayal and loss. He tried to recall every moment of his friendship with Chaik, the shared meals, the laughter during their university days, the celebrations after winning contracts, and none of it matched the reality of what he had just heard. It was as if two versions of Chaik existed, the brother he had loved and the enemy who had plotted against him, both housed in one body, both now lying lifeless on the bed. Adana sat beside him, her hand hovering over his shoulder, unsure whether comfort could even reach him in this state. She stared at the pale, still face on the bed, trying to reconcile the man who once smiled in her living room with the man who had confessed his dark intentions only hours earlier. A heaviness filled the air, the kind that lingers when truths too painful to carry are laid bare. When the doctor returned to confirm the time of death and speak in hushed tones about formalities, Emeka barely moved, his ears deaf to everything except the echo of Chaik's last words. The hospital walls seemed to close in, and Adana knew in that moment that leaving the building would not mean leaving the memory behind. By the time they stepped out of the hospital, dawn had begun to stretch its fingers across Enugu, the sky bruised with shades of gray and orange. The streets were slowly stirring back to life, women sweeping their front yards, early buses groaning awake, vendors setting up trays of akra and bread at street corners. Yet for Emeka, the world's rhythm no longer matched his own. Each sound felt distant, muffled, as if he were walking underwater. His eyes carried the hollowness of a man who had aged years in a single night. Adana walked beside him quietly, her hand clutching his tightly, her own spirit burdened by sorrow. The weight of what had happened was not something words could easily carry. It was the type of grief that carved itself deep into memory, reshaping every thought, every recollection of the past. Emeka thought of the contracts he had shared with Chaik, the times he had defended him against others' doubts, the countless little acts of brotherhood that now stood mocked by the truth of envy. His heart felt torn between rage and sorrow, but neither emotion seemed strong enough to capture the storm within. They boarded a taxi, its driver oblivious to the anguish of his passengers, humming to himself as he navigated the uneven roads. Emeka gazed out the window, his reflection staring back at him in the glass, a man broken by the discovery that betrayal can come not from strangers, but from the hand you hold dearest. Adana, watching him from the corner of her eye, knew the scars of this night would never fully heal. Back at home, the compound was already alive with morning chatter, but the couple slipped quietly inside, shutting the door on the world outside. The walls of their living room, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt heavy, as though the air itself had absorbed the weight of what had happened. Emeka lowered himself into a chair, his face buried in his hands, and for the first time since the hospital, his sobs broke free, raw and unrestrained. Adana knelt beside him, her arms encircling him though her own tears streamed unchecked. She did not speak, for words in moments like this often fall flat, like stones thrown into the sea, swallowed before they touch the depths. She simply held him, feeling the tremors of his grief as her own heart cracked under its weight. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional sound of neighbors outside and the crowing of roosters welcoming the day. Emeka's mind spiraled between memories of joy and the sting of betrayal, replaying Chaik's confession until the words echoed endlessly in his skull. Every kindness he had extended now felt like a blade turned against him, every moment of trust a pathway that led him here. Yet beneath the agony, there was also a strange emptiness, a hollow where love and loyalty once lived, now replaced by questions without answers. Adana's heart ached not just for her husband, but for the cruel truth that a man can share your bread and still sharpen knives behind your back. As night returned once more, the city lights flickering on one by one, Emeka and Adana sat by the window in silence, staring out at the restless pulse of Enugu. The world outside moved on with its noise, its laughter, its endless rhythm, but inside their home, time felt slower, stretched thin by grief and reflection. Emeka finally spoke, his voice hoarse, his words heavy. Adana, I thought loyalty was enough. I thought if I gave, if I shared, if I lifted him, it would erase any room for envy. But I was blind. His words cracked, but Adana squeezed his hand, her own tears glistening in the dim light. You were not blind, she said softly. You were kind. You did what a true brother should do. But not every heart can carry kindness without bitterness. Some hearts twist gifts into burdens. Emeka looked at her, his eyes weary but searching, and nodded slowly. They both knew life would never return to what it was before that night. Chaik's death had left not only grief, but also a scar etched deep into their souls, a reminder that the line between friendship and betrayal is thinner than anyone dares admit. In the silence that followed, as the city outside roared with its endless motion, Emeka and Adana sat together, bound not only by love, but also by the heavy knowledge that sometimes the deadliest poison is not in the food we eat, but in the envy hidden in the hearts of those closest to us. My dear listeners, you have heard this story. One thing it teaches us is that not every smile is genuine, and not every friend wishes you well. Sometimes the sharpest knives are hidden in familiar hands. Be wise in choosing those you trust, and never ignore the quiet voice of your spirit when it warns you. Kindness is good, loyalty is noble, but wisdom is the fence that guards the heart. May every hidden trap prepared for you and your household scatter before it reaches you. May envy in the hearts of others never succeed over your life. May God cover your table, so that no food served to you will ever become poison. May your friends be true, your helpers be many, and your enemies be exposed before they come close. May your family walk in peace, your home remain in joy, and your destiny shine brighter than the sun. In every corner of your life, may the hand of God protect you, guide you, and lift you above betrayal. If you believe this, say a loud and joyful amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.